Training apex-level hypnotherapists and psychotherapists since 1988, the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis is now accepting applications for CADA 3 of our professional training course, taught online by Steve, Pauline and myself. If you resonate with the material on Jung To Live By and believe that your calling is to be a therapist, then check out the link to our course webpage in the description. We look forward to welcoming you on board in June of this year, 2021. Okay, and this question comes from Colt, and he simply says, what is the depth psychology understanding as to why nightmares happen?
Oh, well, that would depend upon which school of depth psychology. I'll give you my view. I think it's probably the most authentic thing I can do.
Well, you're on being asked, yeah.
Thank you. To some extent, I would go along with the classical Jungian perspective and even the Freudian perspective, although I don't think either of them on their own are complete enough. The Jungian perspective would involve the autonomy of the unconscious as they conceive of it. And I say they because there are different views within depth psychology, and there are newer views now within neuropsychoanalysis about what that might be. But within the autonomy of the unconscious model, Jung believed that complexes were the architects of dreams. So when you analyse a dream, you're basically seeing complexes at work, unless, and this is according to Jung, you have a big dream which he would regard as being a collective one and therefore of more universal relevance, not significance. Some people say significance. If you have a dream which is of universal significance, that's pushing you into an area of inflation potentially. Universal relevance is different. That can just be where the psyche has processed some kind of psychocultural, psychosocial element of information for you as an individual and produced a response. That can be in the form of a nightmare. Because it has a certain quanta of energy, libido attached to it, and it pushes itself through in compensation to the ego's normal position. You get this with paranormal phenomena, you get it with artists, where what you have is very often with artists, musicians are usually very good at this in particular because their work's so dynamic and so engaging emotionally that they can pick up on the undercurrent in a culture when it's about to flip or change. So you get a kind of a seismic read very often through musicians about the way culture's going. You can think of it when I say as seismic. If there were to be an earthquake in the San Andreas fault, for example, you would pick up the vibrations, or geologists, earth scientists would pick up the vibrations ahead of that, sometimes many, many months ahead of it. Musicians do this with culture. All artists do. Individuals will pick it up through their dreams. And if it's particularly important that this breaks through into consciousness, it can happen in the form of a nightmare. So you could say that that was a collective level of compensation that appears within the dream life of individuals. So that's one source of nightmares. Then you could resolve that down purely to individual experience. Something needs to be compensated for. It will acquire a certain degree of energy and be powered through, authored by complexes, according to Jung and his followers. There are problems with that. The first one is that things are not neatly polarised into opposites. Although Jungians go on about that, Jung goes on about it too. What you find with that kind of thinking is it becomes a filter that distorts the actual reality of the experience of the psyche for any individual, because between any two opposites that you could delineate by analysis, by reasoning, by experience, there is a whole bandwidth of states, transitional states, and any one of them or any multiplication of them can interrelate at any one time. It's not simply a polarity. The polarities are like the bookends on a shelf of books. that kind of sit there in an obvious sense at the end of that bandwidth. The dynamic exchange occurs along the bandwidth and doesn't necessarily go to the two ends. It can oscillate between different points because they're all energized. And the oppositionality, if you like, can be boiled right down to two issues that are at work, or three or four interchangeably. So don't fall for polarity. What you would need to do to make more sense of it is look for the meaning of the compensation, where compensation is at work. And that meaning may be something as simple as simply moving homeostatically away from something which is too one-sided for homeostasis, not to the opposite end necessarily, but just a little bit of a shift will be sufficient to generate a nightmare with respect to the ego's position. That can happen. Then you've got things like substances. Substances can cause nightmares. Fatigue can cause nightmares. Fatigue, for example, can contribute to a disorder in the reticular activating system within the brain, which is responsible for maintaining consciousness, and you then get sleep paralysis, ectoscopic hallucinations, all sorts of neurological levels of analysis, description and explanation, which produce nightmare-like experiences. There may be no meaningful psychodynamics in there whatsoever. It's just to do with somebody being really tired, maybe they've drunk too much, maybe they've had a substance ingestion, and it's disturbed the balance of the nervous system and produced that kind of response. So it's not just in terms of polarity or anything like that. My own view is inclusive of all of that, but it also includes a more Panksepian and Mark Solms perspective on instincts. It seems that Jung was wrong when he thought the complexes were the architects of dreams, and then in a minority of cases you had collective dreams. It seems from meta-analyses that collective symbolism, collective universal situations and scenarios are at least 50% of the topics, if you like, the scenarios that present within dreams. And those collective elements that present and can sometimes therefore produce so-called nightmares often boil down to instincts again. You'll find people dream about being threatened in a particular way, which resolves into instinct, not archetype. Lustful dreams, sexual dreams are instinctive. Sex is not an archetype, sex is an instinct. Don't make that mistake of archetypalizing things which are properly other things. But instincts for sure: territoriality, aggression, survival, the acquisition of resources, being under threat, status, hierarchical relationships. These are all instinctive, and they form possibly the majority of dream situations that could be called either threatening or nightmares. Complexes are highly personal. That's why they are, according to Jung, the structural units of the personal unconscious. So you will see a complex or complexes in a dream situation, which is a narrative structure which is fundamentally instinctive, and then you'll see the ecology that's created, which is interactive between all of them. But it's still highly personal. There is the instinctive, collective elements, and then there is the personal elements. And that can produce nightmares as well, but it can produce very pleasant dreams sometimes too. So yeah, don't be distracted into some of these one-sided, I'll call them, depth psychological explanations for nightmares. One man or woman's nightmare is another man or woman's pleasure. It all depends on the context of the individual. Complexes exist for sure. They are the fundamental thing that you work with clinically, without a doubt, on the surface. When you get down deep, you don't get into archetypes. They're out in the culture. They're cultural creations. You get into instincts. You get into the genome. You get into the pressure that emerges from instinct, that pressures us to adapt into the world. That's what instincts do. They're concerned with your adaptation in the world. They're concerned with threats to your adaptation. They're concerned with you actualizing yourself sexually, biologically, and they're pushing you in that way, and they will provide opportunities for you to be threatened on the basis of those instincts in order for you to learn in a virtual sense on the inside, so you don't have to make mistakes on the outside. So a lot of nightmares are purely instinctive.
If you're looking to take your study of depth psychology and personal development to the next level, using Steve and Pauline's 40-year-long clinical experience as your personal guide, then make sure you check out Jung To Live By's flagship offering, Discover Your Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook. For anyone who has a calling deep in their very genome to become who they truly feel they should be, this guide is utterly indispensable. Pick up your copy today and make 2021 the year you truly begin to become yourself.